Here we are again. So this time what I want to do in this lecture is it's kind of similar to what I did with Texas and the Great Depression. I'm going to talk about just overarching what was happening in the world in the United States and how that related to Texas history during World War II. And then I'll dive into more specifics on Texas itself and how it was affected by World War II. So let's go ahead and dive in so we can find out exactly what happened in Texas during World War II. Okay, so one thing that I want to do is definitely just briefly talk about, and I'm certainly not going to do this topic justice because there's a lot more information out there. But, Texas, or I'm sorry, the rise of totalitarianism that was happening in the world at the time. Now, there's a really great video clip that's done by the History Channel, and I put that below here, that essentially ties World War I to World War II. And the Treaty of Versailles, which was poorly written and severely punished Germany and Japan and other countries, or Japan not really, they felt like they didn't get what they should have gotten during World War I. But it ties a lot of that to what leads up to World War II. And you can't really understand the rise of totalitarianism and the rise of these dictators like Stalin, like Hitler, like Tojo, and like Mussolini without understanding what happened during World War I. Okay, but essentially, what is a totalitarianism? Government that is a government that takes away individual rights. You're not allowed to join and form organizations. Government controls the media. Schools and youth are brainwashed. They're not allowed to have any kind of academic freedom or think outside the box other than what the government is telling them to believe. Okay. There was also an organization known as the League of Nations at this time, and the League of Nations did a really poor job. It was like the precursor to the United Nations. Ironically, the United States, even though this was Wilson's idea to form the League of Nations, the United States, this was the biggest reason why they didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles. Was because they didn't want to be tied to any country, which causes America to become recluse in this isolationist type of mentality. And this type of isolationist mentality leads to what's known as appeasement. And appeasement is what leads to all of these different countries invading different territories and essentially just getting a slap on the wrist. Nobody really did anything about that. And so you can see this chart is just a real short chart of obvious signs of aggression in the world and the way that the world reacted to them, right? And I think that's why people are so sensitive incredibly to what's happening in the world today on not just being appeasers, being able to stop this type of thing from happening again. This is why people are so sensitive about it today, obviously. Texas, there were a couple people. I mentioned this person before, Pappy O'Daniel, and he is the larger-than-life Texas governor who kind of campaigned on this Ten Commandments kind of campaign. And so he actually is going to leave the governorship and become a U.S. senator. Vice President Garner leaves office, is not run again for the third time with FDR because of the court packing incident. And then the next governor of Texas is a man named Coke Stevenson. And he is very focused on budget and fiscal responsibility. They nicknamed him Calculating Coke because he would hold his pipe and think about things for a long time before he responded. So he got that kind of the nickname. Okay, so now bouncing back to the world stage again, the thing that really tips off World War II is the invasion of Poland in 1939. Now, France and Great Britain at this time had promised to help Poland if Germany attacked. The Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union made a pact in which they literally invaded Poland together, and then they split it in half. We know later on that Hitler backstabs Stalin, and Stalin then joins the Allied powers, which was a really uncomfortable kind of situation to begin with. But the Soviet Union took Western Poland and the Baltic states like Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. And France and Great Britain do exactly what they promised. They declare war against Germany. Okay. Now the Germans are very known for this tactic called Blitzkrieg. And if you didn't know this in football, the term blitz, where you kind of storm the quarterback all at one time, comes from the German term blitzkrieg. Hitler, overtakes France pretty easily, and of course the trying to escape the clutches of the Germans. The British are able to get out at something called the Miracle of Dunkirk, and I think that was a movie too just recently. Really good one to watch if you want to learn a little bit more about this history. And like I mentioned before, I am not going to go into military history on World War II. I'm sorry if I disappoint you on that. I'm happy to point to you in that direction, but I feel like that is definitely talked about quite a bit anyway, right? But the United States, interestingly enough, for 2 years, there's hot debate in the United States on whether or not we should join the war. Now, you might remember that in World War I, it was pretty contentious as well. There were a lot of people that didn't want to enter it, didn't feel like it was really our business. The United States was not part of the League of Nations and didn't feel necessary. So the country becomes very divided into isolationists versus interventionists, right? And so actually one of the biggest isolationists was a man named Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator. And he actually formed a committee known as the America First Committee. If you thought that was a new thing, it's not. That was way back then, in the 1930s. And we also know that Lindbergh was a Nazi sympathizer too, so of course that added to it as well. But this all ends, of course, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941, in which FDR calls this the day that would live in infamy. Now, Japan had made an alliance in September of 1940 with Hitler. The United States, because of this and because of its aggressiveness on China specifically, a lot of people don't realize this, but Japan had actually amassed a greater amount of land and greater empire by the time we entered the war in 1941 than Germany did. A lot of people just focus on Germany and Germany's involvement, but Japan had done quite a bit of the rape of Nanking and invasion of Manchuria and other areas to really terrorize the people in China and in the Korean Peninsula as well. But this was, of course, a surprise attack. A lot of people say there's intelligence that say we knew that it was going to happen, but we weren't exactly sure when. Either way, it happens, right? And you can see the number of people that died on this. On December 8th, FDR asked Congress, and that's when his very famous speech, "The Day That Would Live in Infamy," was spoken, for a declaration of war. And actually it was completely unanimous except for one. I'm happy to tell you about that one sometime later. But essentially 3 days later, the United States declares war on Germany and Italy as well. And so this is what gets the United States into war itself. So what did the war look like for people in the United States at the time? Well, the way that we most mobilized really post World War II, and like I mentioned before in the last lecture, America actually supplies the Allies with quite a few weapons. Even before this, FDR had actually called that the arsenal of democracy, that we couldn't put troops on the ground, but we can supply the Allies. But after Pearl Harbor, that obviously changes, right? The national government takes on a much more firm role, even more firm than it had before. We go from peacetime industries to wartime industries. The War Production Board is created specifically to focus on this. It gave incentives, so a cannon factory would become a munitions factory, a car factory would become a tank and an airplane factory. And so we see this massive mobilization in the United States. So, the industrial motivation, like I mentioned before, and FDR focuses on this heavily, calling ourselves the arsenal of democracy. He believed, and rightly so, that if we could outproduce the enemy, we would win, right? That was a really, really big thing. The other thing to think about was the fact that this is ultimately what gets the United States out of the Depression. In 1938, unemployment was at 19%. It drops to 1.2% by 1944. Assembly lines were created, Liberty ships in record time. All kinds of, government propaganda was produced in order to encourage production and hard work, essentially saying that we're counting on you to take down the Nazis. You've got to produce, produce, produce. And you can look and see there's all kinds of different posters that are created at this time. Okay, so American productivity were so efficient that it doubled what all the Axis powers could make combined. doubled what they could make combined. So America really was the arsenal of democracy, and it really did outproduce the enemies. So what was it like in Texas? Now I've given you like the big picture of what exactly got us into the war to begin with. Well, just like other people throughout the United States, people were buying war bonds. So war bonds are basically loans that are given to the government. They call them Liberty bonds, and you would earn interest on them, and you could get them like out after 7 years. Some of you might have a savings bond, and that's a government bond where you loan them money. So instead of taxes being raised, the United States government trying to go into deficit to get these made, he relied on American people basically loaning them the money. Victory gardens were encouraged. That was so that, you grow your own food so that the canned food could go to the troops who really needed it. They encouraged people to carpool so that the rubber that was needed, the rubber and gasoline, the oil that was needed abroad, and keep your tires inflated so that less rubber would be used. And that was so that it could go on tanks and other things that really needed it at the time. In Texas, steel mills in Houston and Dangerfield were opened up. The number of wage earners in Texas tripled, and women and African Americans are also able to find more jobs than they did during the Great Depression. And manufacturing in Texas quadrupled from 453 million to 1.9 billion in 4 years. Okay, some notable Texans that were involved in the war. First thing I want to mention is the fact that San Antonio is the training base for all aircraft, right? It's got Randolph, Brooks, and Kelly air bases for the aviators. 15 major Army camps are in Texas at the time, about 1.2 million troops between 1940 and 1945. 1 out of every 10 troops were trained in Texas. Some notable Texans: Dwight Eisenhower. He wasn't raised in Texas, but he was born in Texas. Chester Nimitz, which is of course from Fredericksburg. If you go up to the Pacific War Museum in Fredericksburg, it used to be named the Nimitz Museum. That's because that's his hometown. Audie Murphy was the most decorated war hero. He was from Texas. Most decorated. He wasn't just decorated in the United States. He was decorated for every military combat award in the United States, as well as awards in France and Belgium as well. Oveda Cup Hobby here, she was the woman who headed the Women's Army Corps. It used to be the Auxiliary Army Corps. Later on was just shortened to WWII, which was Women's Army Corps, and she commanded the Women's Army Corps, and so she famously did that, and she is from Texas as well. For African Americans, the story was sadly a little bit different. Partial, celebration, and partial, they really had to fight for their rights and to be recognized for this. So the Tuskegee Airmen, if you've seen the movie Red Tails before, it highlights the life of the Tuskegee Airmen, but very brave aviators that fought in World War II. Now, World War II and World War I is different. Initially, African Americans were relegated to supporting roles, but pretty quickly they are elevated to combat roles when it's seen that it's needed. But there are racial tensions that happen. Usually, in 1943 was the most significant year. The race riots that were in Detroit are the most noted one around the United States, but there was a significant race riot in Beaumont at the time. There was 2,000 white shipyard employees that engaged in a riot when there's a false rumor that stated that an African-American male raped a white woman. This sounds super familiar, right? Because this is the cause of almost all the lynchings that happened throughout the United States in this time period. Governor Stevenson declared martial law over the situation. By the end of it, 3 people were killed, 70 injured, and 20 black homes and businesses were destroyed. Many African Americans begin to ask for what's known as a double V, and I'll show you this image here. Okay, so the double V campaign essentially said, let's have a victory abroad. We're all for the victory abroad, beating Hitler and beating Japan, but we have to have a victory against segregation here as well. And so many people, this is the real turning point in which a lot of people become involved in the war, in the civil rights movement itself, where a lot of people and their hearts are changed because of the war when African Americans fight side by side. Now, it is important to note that the defense industries, like the places that produced tanks and, defense contractors, were formally desegregated by the federal government. Like, if you want to do business with us, you have to desegregate. But the armed forces were not desegregated, and they won't be until 1948 by President Truman. And the first conflict, of course, is the Korean War, in which African American and white troops are working together. So the role of women during this time. So the Rosie the Riveter image is, of course, created during this time. Women fill up the factories, and of course they work in different roles like WAC and also WASP, which are the women pilots that would be test pilots at that time. A third of the workforce are women, okay, and a lot of women gain quite a bit of autonomy at this time. Sadly enough, though, many women lose that autonomy post-war when men come back home and they're expected to leave this high-paying job, and it sets the groundwork for the 1960s and 70s feminist movement that will happen. But the fact that they were able to get jobs gave them quite a bit of autonomy at the time. Now, sadly, Japanese Americans were a group that were pretty highly discriminated against, to put it mildly, during the war. So after Pearl Harbor, there was a panic amongst the American public for Japanese people and Japanese Americans. In 1942, FDR issued a very infamous Executive Order 9066, which relocated what he deemed as enemy aliens. These are people of German, Japanese, and Italian ancestry who went into, they called them internment camps, but they have been rephrased as incarceration camps, because that is exactly what they were. Okay, by the end of the war, just the Japanese people, 117,000 of them were incarcerated during this time period. Interestingly enough, and important to note, 2/3 of them were American citizens. They were born on the soil, and they were removed. Their businesses were taken away from them. They came back to absolutely nothing. Okay. So what was Texas's role in this? I actually have a podcast called The Road to Crystal City. It's a book talk done by TPR, and you all are going to listen to that book talk. And it talks about the most famous internment camp or incarceration camp here in Texas, which was Crystal City. So there's actually a map here that shows where Crystal City was, kind of in the valley, and Kennedy and Segoville, which are the three major ones. Crystal City was by far the largest, and it was made up of prisoners that were arrested by the FBI, members of Axis nationalities, but a lot of people from Latin American countries who they were kind of kicking out, and Texas took them in. But then they weren't allowed to go back in. The largest group is from actually Peru. Kind of an interesting discussion in the book chat about Crystal City and what the camp essentially was. But I won't talk as much about that, since you have an entire podcast dedicated to Crystal City and Japanese incarceration. But I will show you a couple of pictures from this. So this is an actual sign that says "Japs keep moving, white man's neighborhood," and this is a Japanese American that is pleading, "I am American," to try to say I'm just as American as you are, just because of the way I look. So really kind of a sad thing that happened to Japanese Americans at that time. Oh, I think there's another picture. This is another one of the internment camps over here, incarceration camps. I've got to learn how to rephrase that myself. So you might remember last time Mexican Americans were actually repatriated during the Great Depression. Well, things are really going to turn kind of differently for Mexican Americans, and now they're going to be desired people to come into the United States for farm workers to take up the farms that were mostly abandoned because a lot of the workers went off to war. But I do want to kind of note a couple significant Mexican American civil rights groups that formed and civil rights activities, most notably LULAC, which is still around today, formed in 1929. Interesting to note that's the largest middle class civil rights organization of Mexican Americans that was formed. They specifically opposed racial discrimination and police brutality, but they didn't believe in too radical because they didn't want to appear disloyal and get on the bad list of the United States, right? But one of the most famous, of course, was Emma Tenayuca here in San Antonio. She launched the largest strike in history of pecan shellers here in San Antonio because of the their bad conditions and poor wages. If you look at that, they had one of the lowest wages paid, $2 to $3 a week. And so, you know, really successful work that Emma Tenayuka did during around this time, about 1938, but it's around the time of World War II. But back to what was happening with Mexican Americans and this guest labor program was called the Bracero program. So in 1942, the United States and Mexico made an agreement, a Mexican farm labor agreement known as the Bracero program. And essentially, they were worried about the fact that farms were not being farmed and they needed that for the war effort. So the agreement they made with the Mexican government was to guarantee a minimum wage, insurance, safe and free housing. But we know that, you know, American farm owners did not live up to this, right? And so the Bracero program is going to plant the seeds of the great boycott that will be Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta later on. Of course, we know that it was pretty bleak the way that a lot of the Braceros were treated. All in all, over the 20 years, so this was supposed to be just a guest worker program during World War II, but it lasted all the way till 1964. Actually, some note all the way to really 1967. So it's about a 22-year program, 4.6 million contracts, largest guest worker program in American history. And here's a couple of pictures of some of the Braceros, some from the Bracero program as well. So I have another clip below also about the Bracero program for those of you that are interested in the Bracero program. But we will definitely talk about this issue as well when we talk about Mexican civil rights when we get to that unit as well. Okay, well, that is it for this, and we will talk to you next time in the lecture about what Texas was like post-World War II.